Thank you so much, Quijada. How's everyone doing? We good? Still have energy? Okay. We have one more presentation before we go into a break, so I'm going to introduce Tim Dutton to come to the stage. He is a board member here at FCA and also a really well-respected community leader and my friend. So please welcome Tim Dutton.
Good afternoon, everyone. That was a perfect setup, I think, for the next conversation that Joe Horeth is going to have. Certainly the issue of Civic Health Index studies is one that the Florida, I used to work at the foundation here, so that happened. Florida Civic Advance is really interested in. So in the process of being interested in the Civic Health Index, we looked around the country, and I found that in Chicago, they recently, in 2022, published a report called Changing the Frame, Civic Engagement Through a Racial Equity Lens. In that afterword of that report, which, by the way, I strongly commend to you, the following was said by Joe Horeth. The 22 Civic Health Report has masterfully brought into clear relief a huge gap in what is known to be standard or traditional conceptions of civic engagement. Specifically, that those conceptions miss a lot of civic activity in Black and brown communities. He talked about how his institute adopted a broad definition of civic engagement of political scientist and philosopher Peter Levine as any action taken with the intent to influence a legitimately public matter. So Joe is the director of the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And he's been very involved in several things, including On the Table program as an independent monitoring team for the Chicago Police consent decree. So Joe's going to really look at the issues of the definition of civic engagement or civic health and how the measurement of that might sort of help evolve the whole conception of what is civic health in our country. Joe Horeth.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to Florida Civic Advance, and, oh, hey, Matt, and everyone involved in pulling this conference together for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure. It's tough to follow Quijada, though. That was a great talk, and I think I will make an effort to connect with her talk in ways that make sense for everyone. Let me pull up my talk here on my tablet. All right. Okay, so are my slides queued up? Oh, I have the clicker. I have the power here. Okay, didn't realize that. So my talk is measuring civic health and civic infrastructure with an equity lens. And, you know, in Tim's very gracious introduction, he already told you a little bit about who I am, but I prepared a little slide just in case. I'm an urban planner. I have a PhD in urban planning. I'm in a college of urban planning and public affairs that has urban planning academic department and public administration, or now called public policy analysis and management, and I've taught in both departments. I am director of the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement, IPSE as we call ourselves. That was created in 2009 when, Quijada pointed out about maybe 5 years ago, we may not have had the context for this gathering, but our institute was created in 2009 when we kind of felt like nobody was really understanding what we were about. And so we kind of hung in there and feel like the world caught up to us in a way. But I'm also a member of the independent monitoring team for the Chicago Police Consent Decree. What does that mean? The Chicago Police Department is under a federal order to institute a whole bunch of reforms and there's an independent monitor appointed to track that, document that, and hold the police department accountable. I'm a member of that team. We do a big survey every other year of Chicagoans' perceptions of and experiences with police, but I'm also a part of her community engagement team where we are liaisons to the community. I'm a senior fellow with National Civic League. I've been in Chicago for 30 years, even though I'm originally from Long Beach, California. How did that happen? I don't know. Soccer dad to 4 great boys, a music lover. I collect vinyl. If you ever Zoom with me and I'm working at home, you'll see my collection behind me on purpose. And my favorite movie is Blues Brothers. Well, I should have known that. I should have known that I'd end up in Chicago if that was, anyway. If you know that movie, you know what I'm talking about. What do we do at our institute? Well, we design and lead public engagements. So glad to see that we're doing World Cafe. We do that all over the place too. We design and lead those engagements usually at the invitation, or almost always at the invitation of a public agency or community organization. We don't just go around saying, hey, we'll hold a public meeting in your community. How about that? There really has to be some conversation and initiative from the institutions or organizations there. And that's an important part of something I'm going to talk about later. We do leadership development and civic learning programming. That's our on-campus activities, really. And then research on the science and art of civic engagement, as I call it, because I believe both are relevant terms. So here's a little roadmap of my talk. First, I'm going to give some background, valuing and improving measurement. I'll talk a little bit about the report that Tim referred to. I'll talk about building the measure that we built, which was just an opportunity for us to put into practice how we were thinking about this concept of civic infrastructure and how it might be designed in a way to be a more inclusive measurement, or at the very least, have a recognition that other things matter in the data other than just the census data. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll end with sort of why does this all matter? How can better measures help promote equity? So here's the report that was written by my colleagues at the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. It's really wonderful to have them as a sister center in our college, and it's led by Amanda Lewis. And it was a study of civic engagement in Chicago through both looking at the Civic Health Index data as well as adding to it, and very similar to the Bella measure that Kihara just talked about, adding to it focus groups and interviews with community leaders and academics as really part of its argument that we need to conceptualize civic health more broadly, and therefore we also need to measure it more broadly. And so it identifies a gap in the traditional conception, specifically how we measure it. The focus on voting and volunteering can often bypass other forms of engagement which may be more common in minority communities. And this is particularly true in Chicago, and I'll talk about that. And there was a very clear intent to flip this notion from a deficits kind of approach to one that's more inclusive. If you're familiar with the Asset-Based Community Development Institute led by John McKnight, that's something, philosophy that has infused into community health work, urban planning work. It's really important conceptualization to community engagement work. And here's an example. This is just a table that's in the report of things on the left that would be included or might be interpreted in terms of the way you answer the question, the census question, as fitting under volunteering, and maybe other things that don't. And so just keying in on a couple of them down at the bottom there that align left and right. So on the left side, repair building a house through Habitat for Humanity. Well, that's a formal thing. There's an organization that exists that does it. You signed up to do it. show up on this day, da-da-da, right? How about if you fixed an elderly neighbor's house on your own, you might not think of that that way, right? But it's actually the same activity with the same intent. You just didn't have the formal intermediary, facilitating that for you. Attending a homeowners association meeting, maybe you didn't think that would be included, but presiding over a homeowners association, well, if you're the president, that's a formal role, right? These are things, this is not to beat up on the Civic Health Index. It's actually a quite effective tool of measuring what it does. But there are other kinds of activities that are just kind of adjacent to it that we could think about that are probably happening in communities where if you put the data from their community next to another community, it looks like they're in deficit or they're lower, right, relative to them. Being the secretary at a church voters meeting or attending the church voters meeting, for example. Again, formality, informality. But the other thing I touched on in my afterword, which, just they're not here to accept this thank you, but I really appreciate them allowing me to comment on this, is something that I observed in Chicago when we first started. In Chicago, and I'm feeling very close to the edge here, so I want to go this way. In Chicago, Chicago is a city of neighborhoods, great city of neighborhoods, very established, very distinct, but also a city with a tradition of incredible segregation. And that segregation was codified in the legal system and in the housing market and capital market, all kinds of ways. But anyway, that's the sort of urban planning geographic context of Chicago. But also historically, these communities are rooted in the Alinsky model, many of them of community organizing. And this was kind of a dominant way that the communities over their recent, I'll say, 75-year history, maybe 50-year history, would engage, right? So is that engagement? Well, if we say voting and volunteering activities and other things, you're talking about a whole different kind of frame, right? There are people who would say, that doesn't work for us, so we do other things, right? And if I do other things, those aren't getting measured unless we, those of us in this room, choose to value them and figure out how to measure them. So in Chicago, this model of the Alinsky model, I'll describe it just real quick. The dominant approach to community change work is, in the Alinsky model, is rooted in challenging power. And there are two necessary elements for it to be effective: organizing strength in numbers through patient one-on-one kitchen table organizing conversations, on the one hand, together with then, when you need to, exercising that power to draw attention and awareness to your issue, maybe even through very in-your-face, almost combative type strategies. And I'll give an example. When about 10 years ago, when Chicago was closing public schools en masse, under the rationale that these schools were underpopulated and were therefore inefficient, and the buildings were crumbling, and the school district needed to save money by consolidating, right? Well, guess where the majority of the schools that were closed were in the black and brown segregated communities. And so a local pastor organized a protest, I guess could be the word, where he got buses and got school kids from schools that had been closed on buses and drove out to a board member's very nice house in a very nice area in the North Shore. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, they all got off the bus and led a very loud protest in his neighborhood. Anyway, that's just a story of a kind of one way of doing this. There's a lot of those kinds of things. But challenging power is civic engagement in Chicago neighborhoods. And so to talk about it, civic engagement in Chicago, and not acknowledge that could be a problem, could be a challenge. In fact, when our institute was started, I almost thought I was going to get laughed out of town for coming and talking about dialogue and deliberation work as, hey, we need to do this. Because folks are saying, we've been doing that. Who are you? Right? And how is that better? And what difference is this actually going to make versus our approach, right? Well, I can get into that too, but I don't want to get into all the philosophy around it, right? But the big point is we really need to work towards getting broader conceptions and conceptualizations and measures of civic engagement. In Chicago, I'm talking about the Alinsky model, but right here in St. Petersburg or Tampa, it could be something different or something else distinctive about that community's history and how it's related to power or how it's historically organized or been prevented or kept from organizing. So that's important. So that's kind of a philosophical thing that had sort of been in our minds as our institute was set up and as we come into this work. And so now I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about building our measure, because we had this opportunity. There was both that challenge, that report, which challenged us to think broadly, and this notion around how communities access resources that has long been, certainly in my mind frame, around community capacity. And so civic health is a fundamental part of a community's capacity. So I'm helping to make a logical flow of argument flow between why measures like this matter and the kind of change and action and results that you all might be trying to do, right? And if it's about we need more resources, if it's about we need this institution to do this or provide this in our community, what are the ways that you access that? Well, in a lot of ways, they're dependent on, accessing those resources are dependent on practices that are actually rooted in things that are measured by your civic infrastructure. So I'm going to talk about how that influenced us in our thinking about when we had a chance to build a measure related to a project. What goes into the measure that we conceived, and then our first test of it. So I'll speak generally, and then at the end I'll talk about the specific. So Quijada had great definitions of civic infrastructure and the history of where it came about. These are some of the definitions that influenced us in our work. Leiniger and Nabachi's book, 21st Century, Civic Engagement in the 21st Century, the laws, processes, institutions, and associations that support regular opportunities. I think we saw the same language on Quijada's slide. This one by the William Penn Foundation, which was in a report they had on 2017 on civic infrastructure, says it another way that I really like because it talks about how you bring two things together. The physical spaces, buildings, assets, as well as the habits, traditions, management, and other aspects, and social cultural processes that bring them to life. These two realms that together constitute a whole. So it's the spaces, places, framework, as well as the people. And this tension kind of is a fundamental one, like even in urban planning, it's like, is it people or is it place? Is it, how do people work in place? And where do you begin your intervention? Is it working with the people or fixing something else about the community? So how might we start to measure this? So we said, well, let's think about some data that's already available. Quijada gave some great tools of ways you can actually collect data. But if you're thinking about what's already available, let's start with that and maybe we can build on top of that. So how might we bring together existing measures on data and civic engagement with readily available data on local institutions to start to develop a relative measure of civic infrastructure? So at least focusing on the presence and capacity of institutions was the way we went here. So the first aspect of the framework was individual and household civic engagement, which is what the Civic Health Index really keys in on from census data. The second is, do you even have organizations locally that are collaborative or supportive around the nature of the kind of work that you're trying to do? Or more generally, do you have organizations that do civic engagement work? Do they exist? That's a 0-1 yes or no. You can just count them, right? And then 3, the capacity of those institutions to do their work. So for example, if you just counted them and you said, well, these categories of organizations or institutions are key for a healthy local civic infrastructure, a small neighborhood CBO and a hospital are getting counted the same, right? And so we wanted a way to sort of recognize that. It's not to say that the work of a CBO isn't as important, but we know capacity matters, right? So how did we build it? Well, here's how we put the data together. And you know, 2 things are really important when you're trying to bring different types of data together, which is time frame and geography. And trying to get those things to align is really difficult. But certainly at the county level, there's a lot of alignment in data sources. And we also know that a lot of data, I see some people nodding heads, maybe you've come across this problem, but a lot of data at like the national level, like CDC data, for example, is by county, and that may not be specific enough, right? But this is where we started in our measure. So for the elements of the individual and household engagement were voter turnout, census self-response, and volunteering, donating, and group membership. Census self-response, you know, did they actually respond to the census? That tends to be something that aligns pretty well with other kinds of civic engagement activity. And then voter turnout was from the MIT election data and science lab. And in many cases, there's things we had to do to this data to make it fit. And so, you know, of course, we've documented all of that. And the second is the density, the presence, and it's really density, but the presence of these collaborative local institutions. And so where could we find such data? Well, County Business Patterns does measure organizations, even including nonprofits. And so we just went through the North American Industry Classification System in a high level of detail. This was a lot of people hours here involved in this to weed it down to, in our specific project, the kinds of organizations that were relevant. Now, if we were doing a more general version of this, it would be way more kinds of organizations maybe than what we identified, but that's what we were doing in this project. And so you can then count those and divide them by the population or do some other kind of way to think about density. And then, you know, here's the number of potential types that are present. So it's the, are they there, but also the kind of scope that they represent. And then here's actually scale. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that word earlier, but capacity. And that was payroll. Just what's a simple data piece we could do. Now, you could argue about how accurate that is or how much that matters, but it tells you something about their size, at least. You'd have to do another layer of this, sort of looking at, well, how engaged is that entity truly? What kind of community work does it do? But, you know, this will certainly catch if you have an anchor institution in your community. And so here was the project, and I'm going to pause. I'm going to hang on this slide for just a moment and give you a little bit of context. So our School of Public Health was working with our state Department of Healthcare and Family Services, which is the entity that facilitates Medicaid. And funding was being available through that entity to local collaboratives, local groups of organizations that had applied for funds to make their local healthcare systems more accessible. And so it was $150 million. I don't know, was there a similar program here in Florida? Or money being made available? I don't know. So it was funding that was made available, and they had partnered with our School of Public Health to study health disparities around the state to get a sense of need in the state related to this issue. And they called us up and asked us to be a part of this project. I didn't initially see a connection, but once I learned how it was structured, I immediately saw one. And so the question was that where we thought we could help contribute to them was, how might HFS identify communities that lack the social infrastructure to apply for these funds, and then provide support so that they can apply for those funds, right? So you might end up with a dilemma, right? Here's where the need is greatest, but we're not seeing that community apply. And that actually may not be that uncommon, right? A community that has high degree of health disparities. You heard from Quijada the data where low civic health was associated with poor physical community health, right? You might see that where a community just doesn't have like enough collaborators, or the organizations don't have the capacity, or there isn't a unifying kind of entity in that community that has the ability to bring together the right pieces or experience with that to produce an application. So here's the specific measure that we ended up with. And you can see in my initial, the little ring I had earlier where I just talked about the 3 components, you know, there was nothing in there about, I just had 3 evenly distributed pieces of the pie. We knew we were going to have to refine that. So with help from the HFS staff, we gained their input on how best to weight the different components of this into an index. And so you'll see there, the presence is this part, I don't have a pointer. Presence, this is the household and individual, and this is capacity, as it says. And so we came up with a measure, an index, and we were able to apply it to the counties statewide. And the map looks something like this. This list is pretty much meaningless outside of the context of this project. But within the context of this project, it's very specific to the presence and capacity of potential collaborators for this kind of money, right? This isn't to be interpreted as a civic health index generally for the whole state. So I'm just being clear about that. And so this is what it looked like. You can see some of the counties in southern Illinois and some of the other places were lowest on the civic health, civic infrastructure index. And the darker counties were ones that were higher. You see the highest there was up near Chicago, DuPage County, which is county just west of Chicago. What is part of this is also whether or not these organizations applied, right? Did you see an application, right? And so this is really the early stage of this. We only had 2 rounds of funding available, but as they did more funding, and I understand the project's sort of on hold, but we could use that information to better refine our measure. So if, for example, we were seeing that areas with low civic infrastructure were actually applying and getting it, right? Maybe our assumptions are off, or something else could be tweaked. So I'll pause there and say that's where we left it. But that's not exactly how the measure, we suggested that HFS use this measure as cleanly as I just suggested it. And I think that's not where the power really lies in civic infrastructure indexes or other measures. The power lies in how you put it together with other information about the resources and the needs of those communities and how that they can get met, right? Because just alone, really even think about any old index, just thinking about it alone just tells you this is a little higher than this, but as far as meaning goes, you need to connect it to some other intent or action, right? So what we did was we suggested they pair up our infrastructure index with a social vulnerability index score, the number of applications serving each county, to get an opportunity score. Okay, that sounds like a lot. But if you think about it, if you have low civic engagement, civic infrastructure index, you have high social vulnerability, this is a CDC measure that exists right now for every county in the United States. We didn't have to create that. So the presumption is high need, and you're seeing 0 or no applications. That might be an area where this department could go in and offer some maybe technical assistance or do a better job of promoting the funding availability or doing something to help them access this money. This is kind of a fundamental problem in the way we make resources available to communities, in my opinion, in this country. We say, oh, we're earmarking all this money. Well, come apply for it, right? Okay, what's involved in getting applied? Well, then you see all the nature of the work that has to be done to apply. That's civic work. That's the work we're talking about in this room. And if you don't have that as a fundamental underlying capacity in your community, guess what? Those opportunities come and go and you don't get them, or you get them and you poorly manage them, or whatever else the story may be in your community, right? You have difficulty accessing them. And so when you apply the opportunity score, you don't just see in the deficits model where there's low civic engagement, you see it together with, hey, here's a high need also, along with, in one measure, a place that has a high need along with a lower civic index, civic infrastructure index score. And yeah, I mean, there's really no reason why Champaign should not have applied for this money, right, at this point. In the first round, right? Urbana-Champaign, where University of Illinois is, right? There seemed like there should be some capacity there. And if you know a little bit about Illinois, you might think of some of the same about some of these other counties. So I'm going to pause there. I know I have plenty of time, but I'm going to leave this as a challenge for all of us in this work. I think that I'm not just advocating for broadening the definition of civic infrastructure. I'm not just advocating for thinking about ways that minority communities, folks in minority communities might be engaged, and let's get to measure them. I'm shooting for the outcome. I'm shooting for the action, right? Let's think about how we can construct tools that better serve the purposes that we're trying to achieve. And that social change outcome is what we're shooting for. So let's build backwards a little bit from that to think about how our measures can support that. Because if we're not measuring what we value, and we're not measuring it properly, then I don't think we're doing our work right. And if you're in the philanthropic community, we know this has been a challenge for philanthropy for decades. It's like, folks are telling us we want money to do this thing, but we don't know how to measure it. We don't know the difference between what's good and bad and everything else. And so sometimes folks like me get up here and we talk all this, statistical mumbo jumbo logical stuff about measures, which is important, and you need that. You need folks bringing that robust thinking to this space, but ultimately we need to be thinking about their utility and what purpose they're serving for the kind of change and work that we're trying to do in communities. So that's the end of my sort of formal presentation. I'm just going to add a couple of points to either questions that were shared before and something that I wanted to say about my institute, which I didn't mention earlier. One was about a question about how we don't hear elected officials talking about this problem. And I think that's a great point, and that for us in this space and in this work, we need to educate them. We need to be not in their faces protesting them like the way I was talking about necessarily in the Alinsky model, but we need to be helping them to see how this is important, almost in the same logical flow that I just said, right? And you can put it in the context of their own community to make it real for them, organizations that they might know or initiatives that are needed in their community to help make it tangible and real, and to help them understand why these kinds of gatherings, or why doing a roundtable World Cafe is not just people getting together and talking, right? It's a real important part of the civic health of your community, and it does have a direct line, in my opinion, to the ability of that community to generate resources and help support its residents. And then the last thing I wanted to say was touch on something we've learned in our work, just like 4 principles of sort of good engagement. And they're not, I've written these up, but we don't have them on our website yet. We're going to get them up there soon. The first is, in your engagement work, a clarity of purpose. So having good data, understanding data is great, but when you're bringing things to community, I think a lot of times we fail to help folks understand how this conversation connects to something, or how it connects to what might be needed, or the change that we're trying to shoot for. So it should be just something real clear that everyone on your team, or everyone in the community, or an elected official, maybe who's blessing your meeting, can state, we're here to talk about this because it's important for improving access to health care in our community, right? If we don't do this kind of work, we don't get the resources that we need. Something like that, right? Something real simple. Second is a commitment to inclusion. Translating documents, and the question we had about that, big factor in the success of your civic engagement work. Are you thinking, in my write-up, I talk about fierce commitment to inclusion. Are you thinking about all the segments in your community that this issue impacts, or is it just universal? So who all is in your community? And to what extent are you making the effort in your engagement work to create space and opportunity for their voice to be measurably included in some way, right? And if it means you got to do a focus group with them, if it means you got to go out to the spaces where they're at, you got to do that, right? And unfortunately, I know that works against timelines and it's expensive, but it's part of it. Transparency of process. You should be able to explain how this information is being fed into this thing that's informing this decision, leading to this outcome, right? So if some group of people are going to be interpreting what happens in a community meeting in terms of the notes or the outcome or whatever, explain that, right? If the conversation is not itself leading to a direct outcome, that's okay, explain that. But don't leave people with the thinking that it is, because that's just as bad, right? So that transparency of process is important. People understanding and knowing. Like, well, I was part of something that I observed a process where recommendations were going to be made to the school board. We didn't know whether the school board was going to adopt those things, for sure. We said that at every meeting. These are recommendations, right? However, what we were careful to do was to ask the school board members to define for us what were non-starters. What were things that were just going to be dismissed and thrown in the trash off the start because they're not legal, or, whatever, right? So you get your guardrails, and if you're effectively communicating that in your clarity of purpose, you're going to be there. And then the follow-up and follow-through. To what extent do you effectively communicate what, at each stage, what was the outcome of this conversation? What was the outcome of the next step? If it was to deliver it to the Board of Education, we delivered it, right? That goes on your website. Maybe you've got people's emails. Maybe you've got people announcing it at community meetings. Hey, remember we had that talk? Here's what's happened with it. Because people are also tired. They're getting civic engagement fatigue. We can't rely on our champions to hang in there with us when they come to meetings and they're not sure what the outcome is of it, or they get cynical, right? And so that follow-up and follow-through needs to be happening and communicated back. So those are just some last thoughts, but I'll pause there, and I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you for that. Can you give us a ballpark estimate of what that would cost to do across Florida?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking for you.
What that would cost to do from a funder perspective to do that kind of work across the entire state of Florida?
Across the entire state.
Just like you did in Illinois.
Yeah. This measure, our role in this project was about $75,000. Just the data part.
You mentioned there was 2 funding rounds that you stopped because of lack of funding in Illinois.
Yeah, in Illinois, well, yes, that you're right. That was our first phase, so we would need to refine it again. The refinement might not cost as much, but that was a team of myself and 3 researchers.
So if we were able to get a group of funders across the state, what would you think the budget would be needed
For
to
that?
raise to do that?
Yeah, just off the top of my head. No.
Ballpark, just so I know what we have to look at, right? There's enough money in the state to do it.
Sure.
Right?
Sure. I think you wouldn't want to do this for less than $150,000, maybe double that if you wanted to do it robustly over a period.
Including the integration to the other index, the social index you were telling me?
Yeah, that's data that somebody can just pull off.
Okay.
That data exists. We didn't have to do anything with it. The challenge that I would say to you, though, is if you wanted to do this data exists at your county level. I think there should be a conversation about whether that's the right geography for what people are interested in. Because, okay, it works well in Miami-Dade County probably, right? You have the overlap there. But I doubt that's going to work well here in this area, right? The central city and the county are not the same, right? And so it's a starting point. But I think what you might want to do is pick population centers and then do more of a focused kind of project, more in line with the paper I described earlier, or Quebrada's belonging thing, to get that qualitative, more deeper data in those population centers to
Do you do this at the county level as well, this kind of work?
I haven't done anything with this measure. We stopped. So really what I'm arguing for is that folks do this kind of thinking. You can do this kind of measure in your community, and it's great, but it's going to be limited because it doesn't address all of the factors and critiques that I talked about earlier. It just says, okay, let's start with presence and capacity of institutions and add those, right? One of this thinking is originated in my dissertation work. I was studying community development corporations. I don't know if there are any in St. Petersburg, but essentially part of what I was studying was what is, how effective are they at what they do, right? But I was looking in different cities, and I realized that in different cities, organizations are limited by the capacity of those cities. So if you're in New York or Boston or LA, where there was quite a robust community development funding structure and infrastructure, you had access to training, you had access to tons of operating support and capital for your building of affordable housing, which is what community development corporations are doing. But if you're in smaller, mid-sized city, pick one, you didn't have those. You didn't have that asset. So it was unfair and really inappropriate to just be comparing them, right? So I think you need to have something that standardizes, but something else that gives you that qualitative contextual information together.
More.
Hi, Andrew Termeekin from the Bob Graham Center for Public Service at UF. You had noted on that slide that compared civic infrastructure, social vulnerability, and could we move over to that one?
Yeah,
and show exactly
whether
what
they
that
had
was?
applied.
Yeah, you had noted Champaign County, where the University of Illinois,
Yeah.
where the flagship campus was located, as a unique case. I'm wondering, are there specific socioeconomic factors? I think it was the next one. Yeah.
Yeah, I know where it is. Up here,
Perfect.
right?
Yeah. Are there specific socioeconomic factors in perhaps a generally rural but college town kind of community that may have contributed to Champaign County, or are there something more unique going on there? Is that something that counties like Alachua or Leon in Florida may also face if we collected this data in our state?
I think I'd have to go in and look at exactly what the numbers were in their infrastructure index around presence. I suspect they didn't have that many health-specific kinds of collaborating organizations in this context. You know, the U of I's hospital, med school, is actually located in Chicago, so it's not there, right? I don't know. I don't know enough about the local context to speculate beyond that, but I think that's the case. It's sort of college town, university campus, and then a few community serving organizations for the basically non-college population side of things in that town, because that's the part that would probably benefit from this the most, from an improved healthcare transformation, improved healthcare delivery service in Champaign.
Thank you.
Sure. Thought there was one more question.
Is it?
No, there's a question.
Where are we? Do we have time for one more? One more? Or, yeah, okay.
I'm coming from kind of a similar context. I'm Liz. I work at the Center for Leadership and Service at Florida State. So one of the contexts that I was thinking of when we were talking about social vulnerabilities is just the differences in social vulnerability between, say, Leon County and Miami-Dade. How can you effectively cross-compare those qualitatively in research like this?
You know, I'd have to look into the elements, just like I was saying for my measure of where Champaign scored. I'd have to look into the components of the social vulnerability score and what make it up. But I think the only way to do it is contextual, rich, contextual local information. Talk to people who actually do that work in that community and neighborhood or area, city, and understand what the barriers are that they face. That is the part that might be distinct to that community. And you're just, sometimes that stuff just doesn't show up anywhere in data. You're just, you know, I don't know, Kihara might have more to say about that in her experience too. It's just, you're just not gonna know enough about the whys and the nature, because the other thing that happens is a lot of times, and I learned this in studying community development corporations 20 years, 30 years ago, executive directors get very skilled about working around those challenges, but they're still there, right? And so the fact that they're still there means it's just, maybe they can get those resources, but you haven't solved the problem, right? So yeah, but the social vulnerability index, the one we used, I believe it's CDC. They fully document everything. Can somebody correct me if I'm wrong, on the CDC website? I don't know if anybody knows that. Yeah. Or was that our last question? Somebody has their hand up, so.
I think we have to go to a break. I'm so sorry. I know you have a question, just trying to keep us
We
to
can
time.
talk afterward.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.